Now we'll come to discussing about behavioral genetics and the environment. Now, the interaction between the two, we know for a fact that neither of them are more like most important, right? It's not only genetics that affects our behavior, and it's not only environment. We'll also discuss about in certain cases one of them is more important than the other, right? And that sort of thing. So behavioral genetics is basically the study of how genetics and environmental factors affect psychological characteristics, right? If the so what they basically do is they take people who are genetically similar, right, and then they test them, and people who are genetically not similar and test them, and then see whether there is significant difference between the two groups, right? If there is significant difference, it's indicating that okay, genetics is having a role. Then within that group, they will check the correlations. If correlations are high compared to the correlation here, right, again they'll get more substance to their claim that genetics has a role, right? uh, Similarly, heritability is basically the estimate to which the difference of specific phenotype within a group of people can be attributed to the differing genes. So heritability is between generations, right? And whether a certain kind of behavior is being learned by another generation of people and whether that is being expressed or not, right? So when you talk of genetic basis of behavior, there are two things. There is the genotype and there's the phenotype, right? So genes have two ways in which they manifest. The genotype is what the software is. So that is what the gene is, right? So it's the makeup of the individual. So you can have, say, genotype of a tall genotype and a short genotype, right? Or you can have aggressive genotype, right? So it's like a software. This is what the pre-wiring is, right? When the genotype expresses itself, it becomes the phenotype, right? Now, this expression of the genotype is dependent on a lot of factors, especially environmental factors, right? So it may or may not manifest in the same way. So say somebody has both parents who are tall, right? Both parents are tall, genotype is of software is obviously made out of tall genes, okay? But maybe some grandparent was really short, so they have a recessive gene also of short, right? Now, whether this person will grow up to be tall or not is dependent on multiple things. For example, the amount of nutrition they get, right? Or the kind of environment that they have, or some other stuff, right? Socioeconomic causes. Now, what it expresses itself as is what the phenotype is. That is the observable characteristic of the individual. So, if the gene, right, expresses itself normally, and this person grows up to be tall because the dominant genes are of tall person, right, then the phenotype and the genotype are in sync, right? Sometimes they may not, right, and they may be really short compared to the parents. Then the phenotype is not similar to the genotype and is more environmental influences are taken place, right? So differences between genotype and phenotype is that genotype has all the genes, but not necessarily that all will be expressed. So the genotype in this case has tall dominant tall genes and recessive short genes, right? But the phenotype is only of if the person is tall, then the dominant genes are seen. If the person is short, then the recessive genes are seen, right? So the phenotype is only of one kind, whereas genotype is of all the data that is available, right? The person who spoke about this is Gregor Mendel, another favorite question of net. So they'll ask about Mendel, they'll give in your match the following, and then you have to figure out what he actually helped with. So if phenotype is mentioned, then that's Mendel's main contribution, right? Now, there are lots of things that genes affect, right, in terms of human characteristics. So a general nucleus of a cell has 23 pairs of chromosomes. I think all of us know this. There are 46 chromosomes and 26 pairs. 22 of them are identical in all humans, and they are known as autosomes, right? The sex cells, that is the 23rd chromosomes, which are known as allosomes, right? Which is different in shape and size and length compared to other chromosomes. So the sex cell looks very different to other cells. And the sex cells between the two sexes is also very different, right? So some people have XY, that is males, and females have XX, right? So the sex cells are known as allosomes. They are the 23rd pair of the uh, chromosome, and they are not identical to the rest 22. The rest 22 chromosomes look very similar. They all have their own work. They look very similar, and they are together known as autosomes, right? So autosomes are 22 pairs of chromosomes, Allosome is the sex chromosome, which is different in shape and size and length compared to these 22. And within itself, there are two types. There is the XY and the XX, right? Some people are born with XXY chromosomes in the 23rd chromosome, right? That is known as the Klinefelter syndrome. So when you have XXY as the chromosomal anomaly, right? Then the person is said to have Klinefelter syndrome, right? A chromosome is made out of DNA. I think all of us know this, and a DNA is made out of four types of chemical bases, which I always think of as ACTG because in Bangalore, internet is ACT internet, right? So ACT is there, and I just remember GSG, right? So adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine are the four chemical bases of which the DNA is made, right? So your entire DNA across your body are different combinations of these four chemical bases, right? A, C, T, and G. So you remember this as ACT G. Remember Klinefelter syndrome, XXY. Autosomes are the 22 identical pairs that are there in humans, and your allosome is the 23rd pair, right? Um, the technical term for any sort of abnormality in the chromosome is referred to as an allele, right? ALLELES, which is the alternative characteristics that are developed due to alternative genes or any form of mutation. So people who suffer from Down syndrome, they usually have a trisomy in their 21st chromosome, right? So usually there are pairs. The 21st chromosome for someone with Down syndrome has three parts like that, right? So that's an allele, right? So very important PPT, basically this screen is for you, right? There are 22 pairs of chromosomes that are identical. They're called autosomes. The sex cell is called allosome, and it's the 23rd pair of chromosome. Within the pair, you can have two different types, usually XY and XX. XY is the male and XX is the female sex cell, right? Some people have more anomalies than that. The most common one is XXY anomaly, which leads to the Klinefelter syndrome. All of this is created by the DNA, which is the deoxyribonucleic acid, which is formed by four chemical bases, that is adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine, right? ACT G. Any form of mutation in any of these 23 pairs of chromosomes can cause an abnormality in the person. The most common one that we study is the trisomy in the 21st chromosome, which means that instead of two pairs, we have three parts to the 21st chromosome, which leads to the person having Down syndrome. Clear? Now, there are two ways in which we study the effect of heritability and genetics. One is by doing family studies, which is the degree of similarity of behavior of similar relatives, right? Uh, of the trait in question. So you say personality, then you take an entire family system, and then you give all of them the personality test, and you try and see how similar they are to each other, right? So that's one way in which we study um, the effect of heritability and behavior, right? So obviously, if you're from the same family, the like chances whether they are high or not of similar personality to exist, right? Another study is of using adoption studies. So you take people of you take adopted children, right, with genetically similar parents and then you take adopted children and then you test them for their personality, and then you test people who have adopted them and people who have given birth to them, right? Biological parents and adopted parents. And then you see the correlation, then you see which one has higher. So that gives you another indication of whether genetics and heritability are interlinked or not, right? And sometimes you'll also use twin studies, right? Where you again, twin is a family study only. Twin studies are basically family studies because they're uh, part of the same family, right? So when we discuss the brain or genetics with intelligence, these things you have to remember, okay? Research has shown us that for identical twins that are reared together, which means identical twins who are reared together, not with their parents or anything, together, right? Their correlation is high, right? Almost zero point 0.7. Identical twins who are reared apart, right? Meaning that they are in two different families, their correlations are nearly as high, right? Then you have fraternal twins, whether they're reared apart or reared together, the correlation is slightly lower, although it's still above zero point 0.5, right? So for all three of these cases, the correlations are really high, which is an indication that genetics is obviously playing a role, right? Identical twins are twins that that share the same amniotic fluid. Fraternal twins are twins who don't share the same amniotic fluid. So the amniotic fluid is where the DNA usually is for both the children who are being born. So identical twins have the same DNA set, sort of thing, not the same DNA, but they share the same fluid. Fraternal twins have slightly different compositions of their amniotic sac, right? So there's a slight difference in terms of the kind of genetic material that they have, right? Now, obviously, siblings are at two different time points, so their genetic composition is going to be more different, and then cousins are going to be slightly more different, and so on, right? So higher correlation between these things is indicate these things I'm saying these twins is telling you that the genetics is obviously playing a role, and it's slowly getting lesser and lesser as the amount of genetic information starts to take like more longer steps, right? IQ of adopted children correlates similarly with both their biological parents and their adoptive parents, right? So this is an interesting study. What it's trying to tell you is that although genetics is very important, right? The your environment that you're growing up in is also equally important, which is indicated by adoptive parents, right? Uh, Till now, they've not found any gene for intelligence, so we don't know whether there is a particular chromosome or a certain gene that affects intelligence, right? But we do know that um, family is important in terms of genes. So if you have high IQ families, then there's a higher chance that your children will have higher IQ. It's not a necessity. Again, it's a correlation. It's not causation. It's 0.6, 0.5, 0.57, right? But it's still a possibility, right? So genetics and heredity account for almost 50 to 70% change in intelligence. We've also seen that when people are adopted and they move from a like a low socioeconomic household to a higher socioeconomic household, their IQs can really jump, right? Almost by 10 to 12 points. Uh, Siblings reared together have high correlation, right? Correlation of 0.32 between unrelated adoptive children living together. So this is a very low correlation, right? Which is showing you that, okay, environment is having only zero point 0.3 sort of an influence on their uh, IQ levels. They're two unrelated adopted children who are living in the same house, like a foster family, right? Difference of home environment is more important in lower socioeconomic conditions. So if you move from a lower to a higher socioeconomic condition household, your IQ will jump, right? Whereas if you move from high to high, your IQ may not be affected as much because nutrition, etc., plays a role in terms of how the brain functions, right? So children in impoverished homes moving to better homes show increase in IQ by 10 to 12 points almost, right? Um, then when you discuss something like schizophrenia is one of those disorders which has a very high genetic and family heritability, right? The person who found this is called Seymour Ketty, right? And there's almost like a 12% similarity in terms of genes for twin studies. For twin studies, the correlation is almost at 60 to 70% again. So compared when you compare trait similarities in identical fraternal monozygotic twins, trait similarity is high correlation in case of schizophrenia with family members also. So intelligence is still lesser in terms of its correlation compared to schizophrenia for families also, right? So within families, if there is a person with schizophrenia, the chances of that manifesting for the rest of the family is much, much higher, right? Again, it's not a necessity. It's not that it will happen, but the correlation is high. So there is a high chance of taking place, right? When it comes to personality, this is something that NET will usually ask you. This is a zero point 0.5 correlation, so there's a 50% chance, right? Important finding was that family environment played a very limited role in determining personality, except when there is extremes of environment, right? So if there is extreme of neglect or abuse, then that has an effect on the personality to a greater degree. Other than that, if all of that is kept similar and there is like homogeneity in terms of the environment and it's a decent environment and a normal environment, then it's usually the genetics that has a greater role in terms of determining personality. It's more temperament than personality, but still, right? Similar studies have been found for twin and adoptive studies. So basically, the gene and environment interaction is that the environment cannot affect the genotype because obviously genotype is the storage of the software, but it can affect its expression and the phenotype, right? So the environment affects which part of the genotype is going to be expressed and how much, right? And that's the phenotype. So there is like something known as the reaction range, right? Which is a measure of how much the environment can affect genetics, right? So for different paths, the reaction range is slightly different. Then there are evocative influences, which is a child's genetically influenced behavior may evolve certain responses from others. So, for example, some children are naturally, say, introverted, right? Now, depending on the parent, if the parent accepts the child to be introverted and that's it, there's no problem, no friction will take place. But sometimes parents want the children to be extroverted, right? So they'll start to push them and force them to be that way. So what that does in effect is that genetically wired behavior will start to change and it will modify and the person will become maybe more extroverted, right? And it will evoke certain reactions from other people and it might evoke certain reactions from themselves. They may like it, they may not like it, lots of stuff might happen, right? So that's what is known as an evocative influence. Important, okay? Sometimes Net will ask you some questions about this. So um, the all vertebrates, right? All vertebrates have bilaterally similar symmetrical bodies, meaning that this side and this side of your body are going to be similar, right? Uh, and if you cut it in different ways like that, like that, like that, right? The brain is going, the body is symmetrical, basically. Just think of it like that, right? Um, Now, there are different ways in which the anatomy is dissected, right? Um, and this is primarily for how doctors see the body, right? But different parts of the body are named, technical terms are given according to the way they dissect the anatomy, right? So it's very important to know this much. Uh, the body may be looked at from a proximal manner or a distal manner, right? So this first picture that you see, this is the proximal or the distal manner. So something that is closer to the trunk, right? Closer to the trunk is this part, this area, right? Whatever is closer to this is called the proximal area. Whatever is far away from this is known as the distal area, right? So if you take your right arm, the joint here is proximal, your fingertips are distal. Your thigh is proximal, your toes are distal, right? So that's one way in which we conceptualize the body, right? Proximal versus distal, right? Then sometimes they'll do lateral versus medial. So this is basically, they'll divide the body this way, right? They'll cut it from the middle this way. Whatever is closer to the middle line, right, to the center part, will be medial. Whatever is far from this line is distal. So if you span your arms out, your fingertips will be lateral and your chest will be medial, right? So then split the body this way. Whatever is closer to this line will be medial. Whatever is far away from this line will be lateral, right? So proximal is closer to the trunk. Distal is far away from the trunk. So there's no cutting basically. It's just what is close to the trunk and what is far away from the trunk. Lateral and medial is where they split the body this way. Whatever is closer to this part, your chest is closer, right? So that is your medial, and whatever is far away is lateral, right? And then there is anterior or ventral or posterior or dorsal. So anterior is the front portion, the third picture, right? Posterior is the back picture, back part, right? This is easy to remember because posterior is also sometimes referred to the butt, right? So people might call the butt posterior. So then you just remember that, okay, back part, anterior is the front part. To confuse you, they may say ventral or dorsal. So when they say ventral, they're saying front side. When they say dorsal, they're saying back side, right? So proximal is closer to the trunk, distal is far away from the trunk. Lateral and medial is when the body is split this way into two halves, right? Whatever is closer to that line is medial, whatever is far away from that line is lateral, and whatever is in front is anterior or ventral, whatever is at the back is posterior or dorsal, right? So if they say suppose anterior cingulate glutamate or something like that, right? That means it's in the front part of the body, right? If they say posterior something something, it means at the back of the body. If they say medial something something, it means it's closer to this. Right? If they say lateral something, then it's farther away from the midline. If they say proximal distal something something, then it's closer to the trunk. If they say distal something something, it's away from the trunk, right? So this is very important for you to remember. Okay.